After the first day of heavy fighting, it will look like Theodosius is done for. But as we'll see, a key defection and a little divine intervention will help turn the tide in the Eastern Augustus's favor. But though he would eventually win the day, Theodosius's tactics would wind up having one major unintended consequence, as Alaric and his Goths would leave the field mighty disgruntled. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, episode 159, The Divine Winds. Last time, we left off on the eve of a great battle. In the late summer 394, the army of Theodosius entered the Alpine passes, and the army of Arbogast and Eugenius sat a few miles east of Aquileia waiting for them to emerge from the mountains. Today, we'll get into the guts of the battle that is about to ensue, and then get into the guts of what happened next. Since he was just 47 years old, you would think that what happened next was another 15-odd years of solid rule from Theodosius before he handed the reins of power off to his two now grown and groomed sons. But instead, less than 6 months after his great victory at the Frigidus River, Theodosius was dead, and the empire was forced to hand the reins of power to the dead emperor's still underage and not at all properly groomed sons. With no shortage of powerful and ambitious men more than willing to exploit the deficiencies of the inadequate brother emperors, Theodosius's early demise turned out to be one of the more destabilizing events in an era absolutely rife with destabilizing events. But before we get into that, we must turn our attention to Theodosius's last great triumph. A triumph that will eventually be painted as nothing less than proof that the Christian God was more powerful than all the pagan gods put together. Adding to the notion that the coming battle was some kind of religious showdown, when Arbogast and Eugenius arrived at the spot they had chosen to meet Theodosius, they planted a statue of Jupiter on the field, and then affixed images of Hercules to the banners of their troops. With the old gods of Rome watching over them, the army of the West awaited the army of the East. Now, whether these details are a later embellishment or not is on a vaguely pro-pagan stance Eugenius had adopted for his regime. But, as I said last week, the war between East and West was not about paganism and Christianity. It was about power, pure and simple. I don't think any neutral observer could be blamed for believing that Theodosius was doomed the minute he emerged on the west side of the Alps in early September 394. He popped out into the Frigidus River Valley in modern Slovenia and was immediately greeted by the troubling specter of Arbogast's army. Not only was it troubling that they were there at all, but the highly capable Frankish general had seized every piece of high ground in the valley. Wherever Theodosius looked, he was looking up at Arbogast's soldiers. That alone would have been enough to give any commander a moment's pause. I mean, do I really want to attack an enemy who so completely controls the terrain? We don't know if Theodosius paused, but if he did, it wasn't for very long. The emperor decided that crappy position or no crappy position, he was going to attack. As soon as his men were lined up for battle, the Eastern legions launched themselves forward in a full frontal assault. Well, I suppose saying the Eastern legions is a bit misleading. Out in front of this initial charge was Alaric and his Goths. Through an ultra-intense day of fighting, the Gothic auxiliaries wound up bearing the brunt of Arbogast's counterattacks, while Theodosius kept the legions properly pulled back in reserve. The casualty rate of the Goths was so high that when the battle was all over, it was said that Theodosius had actually beaten 2 enemies that day, with Alaric joining Arbogast in defeat. When the dust settled, the Gothic chief and what remained of his men certainly came away thinking that Theodosius was up to slightly more than just trying to defeat Arbogast, and that he had purposefully spilled the blood of the Goths to weaken them politically and militarily. The hard feelings generated by the way they had been used in the battle would last for a generation, winding their way through a brief revolt that we'll get to in a second, and ultimately leading to the stunning, if not exactly strategically important, sack of Rome 15 years later. The first day of the battle ended without a decisive victory for either side, but it was obvious to everyone on both sides that Arbogast was getting the better of Theodosius. In the camp of the Western army, spirits were high, and everyone was under the impression that victory was just a good night's sleep away. On the other side, in the camp of the Eastern army, morale was non-existent. They were just a bunch of men sitting around waiting to die. Even Theodosius despaired at his chances, and he spent the evening in prayer, attempting to gin up some sort of miracle that would salvage his chances. And given everything that's about to happen, it's fairly easy to see why later chronicles might play this up and report that God decided to answer Theodosius' prayers. The first little turn of fortune came during the night. Arbogast still commanded the high ground of the battlefield, but the passes that the eastern legions had emerged from were still wide open, and the Frankish general was concerned that Theodosius would get it into his head to retreat rather than stay and fight. So he ordered a strong detachment of soldiers to march around Theodosius' camp and occupy the entrances. Bottled up and broken, Theodosius would most likely offer his surrender by lunchtime the following day. But the commander of this detachment knew an opportunity when he saw it, and when he got into position, he sent word down to Theodosius saying that he'd be happy to defect if the price was right. Since the Eastern Augustus was basically facing his own imminent death, the commander could pretty much name what that right price was, which he did, which Theodosius immediately agreed to pay. The detachment defected, the passes remained open, and Theodosius' army gained some much-needed reinforcements. The second, and more famous turn of fortune came the next day after the two sides had resumed their fighting. The only problem is that there are no guarantees that it actually happened the way that later historians claim that it happened. It's eminently plausible, but since the specific details that have been passed down to us didn't start cropping up until years later, it is entirely possible that the whole incident is just a figment of some overzealous church historian's imagination, as a way to graphically depict how God had stepped into the fighting on Theodosius' side. See, there is this weather phenomenon that lurks around the Eastern Alps called the Bora, hugely intense windstorms that have been known to gust with the strength of a low-grade hurricane. On the second day of battle, one of these windstorms kicked up, and wouldn't you know it, it blew directly into the face of Arbogast's army. As the two sides approached each other, the Western army was rendered practically blind by the dusty winds blowing directly in their face. The Eastern army, on the other hand, had the wind at their back, and so advanced completely unaffected. It is written that the winds eventually became so strong that the spears lobbed at Theodosius' army were blown back at the very men who had thrown them, and that the arrows fired were shot back at the very men who had fired them. Arbogast's army, so close to victory the night before, quickly fell apart in the face of the torrential wind. By the end of the second day, the army of the West was broken, and those who could not flee were captured. Theodosius had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. Could it be anything less than divine intervention? Among those captured was Eugenius. The would-be emperor was brought before Theodosius, whereupon he nobly dropped to his knees and began begging for his life. Though Theodosius was typically magnanimous in victory, this magnanimity had its limits, and self-proclaimed emperors received no quarter. Eugenius was executed, and his head was put on display for all to see. Arbogast, meanwhile, managed to escape from the battle unharmed, but after spending a few days in the hills dodging patrols like some common criminal, he concluded that it was high time that he took the honorable path out of this predicament, and he committed suicide before he could be captured. The deaths of Eugenius and Arbogast meant that for the moment at least, across the whole expanse of the Roman Empire, from Spain to Syria, and from Africa to Britain, no one opposed Theodosius. For a few months in late 394 AD, Theodosius stood as the only emperor in the Roman Empire. he would be the last man to hold that distinction. Just as he had done following the victory over Maximus, Theodosius completed his march by entering Milan and setting up court in the Italian capital. There was much to be done and much to grapple with, and Theodosius knew he was going to have his work cut out for him. The war with Eugenius and Arbogast had been even bloodier than the war with Maximus, which hurt doubly since the legions had not really gotten back to full strength since that last civil war. Both the Rhine and Danube frontiers were now dangerously under-garrisoned. On top of his military woes, Theodosius also knew he was going to have to deal with the headache of rolling back the pagan tide that had risen in his absence. Committed more than ever to his Nicene Catholicism following the miracle victory at the Frigidus, Theodosius began to undo the religious damage done by the pagan aristocracy of Rome. It was at this point that the altar of victory disappears from the historical record, never to be heard from again. So, quit asking me to put it back in the Senate House. It's gone, so get over it. Since Theodosius' historic place as the last sole ruler of the Roman Empire is often listed near the very top of his imperial resume, you might be inclined to think that he held this distinction for a few years. I mean, at least a year. But not so. The correct answer is 4 months. All that stuff that Theodosius knew he was going to have to deal with wound up getting dealt with by someone else. Because in mid-January, the emperor came down with what historians label as a nasty bout of edema. Doctors were called and everyone prayed, but it all did no good. On the 17th of January, 395 AD, Theodosius died. He was 48 years old and had been an Augustus for 16 years. Did I mention that he was the last sole ruler in the Roman Empire? Theodosius was an enormously influential ruler, and though I don't think he cracks into that upper tier of truly great emperors, there is no getting around the fact that the history of the world runs right through his reign. Obviously, his staunch Catholicism and eventual staunch anti-paganism spelled the end of the old religions of antiquity. Monotheism was here to stay. Christianity was now the religion of the empire. But beyond the official public policies, Theodosius' own personal piety allowed the Western Church, in the form of Bishop Ambrose, to establish once and for all a degree of autonomy from the secular ruling class, and even a degree of power over it. As I mentioned previously, the next 1,000 years of political philosophy will revolve around the relationship between church and state, and I'm not sure that debate even gets started if Theodosius refuses to yield to Ambrose in the months after the massacre at Thessalonica. But the emperor's religion was not a PR stunt. His Christian beliefs were heartfelt, and he took Ambrose's threats to his soul seriously. So, Theodosius did what the bishop demanded he do, and in the process set a precedent that later kings and popes would follow. Finally, given that he did play such a major role in the final entrenchment of Christianity, which I think we can all agree is a pretty big deal, the major role Theodosius played in ensuring the empire did not collapse following Adrianople is sometimes lost in the shuffle. But that too was a pretty big deal. His ability to recognize the stark reality of the empire's situation, that they could not risk another battle, that they must deal with the Goths diplomatically, is perhaps even more important to the